Hey, we just finished talking about preparing to do theology well by preparing our heart for theology. We talked about the contrast between theology in the flesh and theology in the spirit. So next what we're going to do is we continue in this preparation idea, and we're going to focus on preparing our minds for theology. So as we explore preparing our minds, let's start once again with a short devotional word. Mark chapter 12, verse 28 through 30. Here, let me read it to you. One of the scribes came and heard them arguing, and recognizing that he had answered them well, he asked of him, speaking of Jesus. So he asked of Jesus, what command is the foremost of all? And Jesus answers, the foremost is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. Does this sound familiar? It should sound familiar. We've already had a devotion specifically on Deuteronomy chapter 6, something called the Shema, in our very first session together, which is exactly what Jesus is quoting here, the Shema from Deuteronomy chapter 6. And often we go to Matthew chapter 22, and where Matthew also records Jesus in the same conversation here. It's just another iteration, but there's something different that happens in this one with Mark. Mark's iteration and recording of Jesus's reply actually includes the phrase, with all your mind. And so with all your mind is the Greek word dianoia, which means it's the word for understanding or intellect, right? Or mind or inner, like insight. When we go back to Deuteronomy chapter 6, it only says with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. So why did Jesus add dianoia here? Well, here's the thing. In Hebrew, in the Hebrew language, there's the word that's used in this particular phrase, in the Shema, in Deuteronomy 6. It's the word labab. Labab refers to the inner man, which includes both the mind and the will and the heart. So in Deuteronomy 6, when we translate that, and it only says with all your heart, right? What's happening is communicating both your mind and your heart. So in the Greek language, Jesus is simply clarifying what was already there in the Hebrew, right? There's an intellectual side of loving God, is what Jesus is trying to tell us. It's consistent with what was taught, with what was practiced and believed from the earliest days of Jewish life, and there's a connection for it to be the same in the modern Christian life, that we would love the Lord our God with all of our heart and soul and our minds, in addition to our strength. So let's talk about a quotation here that opens Putman's chapter on preparing our minds for Christian theology. He says, if we submit, this is a quotation of a philosopher, Blaise Pascal. He says, if we submit everything to reason, our religion will contain nothing mysterious or supernatural. He says, but if we shook the principles of reason, then our religion will be absurd and ridiculous. So think about this for a quick second, right? If we submit everything to reason, then we're eliminating anything mysterious or supernatural, right? So what does that mean? Like, have you ever seen this where a theologian or a faith tradition is nothing but cerebral? It's just all in our head, and we have to be all reason and logic, and it has to be proven 100%. And what happens is there's very little room in that environment for the Spirit of God to work, right? But Pascal says, if we shook the principles of reason, we just threw all the reason out, then he just says our religion is going to be absurd and ridiculous, right? Then there's no parameters for how it should work. We can do and say, be whatever we think or want or feel or desire, and there's no way to check it, right? Here's a principle I want us to understand we've kind of already begun to put this together, but it's going to become incredibly important over the process of building our theology, is that we have to find the balance. So are you used to hearing me say that yet? There is a balance, a tension of complementary ideas, complementary components, complementary theologies. There's a balance, and we have to hold that tension between the two sides. We want to try to avoid being on an extreme either direction, but we have to hold the two in tension together. So these mirroring temptations, no matter where you lean or how you stand, how firmly you stand or not, but these two mirroring temptations, here's what they do, is they kind of put faith and knowledge against one another, right? And the results is it casts the study of theology in a suspicious light. So I want to unpack these two mirroring temptations, then we'll begin to kind of work towards a more complete understanding. So the first on one side is the refusal to believe Christian truth without thorough rational proof, right? So that's the intellect side that he was talking about. Or an anti-intellectualism who scoffs at any form of reason, study, or intellectual pursuits. So those are the two mirroring components, right? Where one side is everything has to be proven rationally, and the other side that says anything rational is laughable, right, and unuseful. So let's kind of unpack these two mirroring temptations, and then again we'll work towards something that's a little bit more of a complete understanding. So the first side of the coin here is faith without understanding, or fideism. In fideism, belief systems are not subject to rational evaluation. So faith doesn't require rational proof or justification. It involves only commitment and trust, right? Not intellectual certainty. So all we have to do is believe, and if we believe, then anything can happen, right? Here's some problems with that. Without any appeal to reason, the fideist has little or no means to establish the truthfulness of his belief when confronted with contrary claims. So without reason, the fideist opens himself up to holding logically incoherent or even contradictory views of God. Right? If faith is a blind, irrational decision, then how does one decide which faith to believe in? Right? So we can't be a pure fideist is problematic, right? Because it's just saying believe and everything's okay, but there's no real way to check or decide what those beliefs are. So there's a really fascinating quote from a fideistic perspective from Martin Luther. Here's what Martin Luther said. He said, "Reason is the devil's greatest whore." Wow, that's some harsh words. He says, "By nature and manner of being, she is a noxious whore. She is a prostitute, the devil-appointed whore, a whore eaten by scab and leprosy who ought to be trodden underfoot and destroyed, she and her wisdom. Throw dung in her face and make her ugly. She would deserve the wretch to be banished to the filthiest place in the house, to the closets," right? Martin Luther isn't holding back in any way. He is an absolute fideist. He's like, man, we do not need reason and logic. So for Luther, faith should never be placed under the dominion of reason. The flip side of the argument from the fideist is something called rationalist, or the rationalism. And this is the idea that understanding in order to believe. So rationalists, one should not hold religious beliefs without convincing proofs from evidence or reason. So for a religious belief system to be properly and rationally accepted, it must be possible to prove that the belief system is true in a way that is both convincing and reasonable to anyone. So when we think through and kind of deep dive into this rationalistic type of view, it's problematic, and it's problematic for a number of reasons. So it's unlikely that a strong rationalist will find an argument for theism that is convincing to any reasonable person. There's always going to be people out there who aren't going to be reasonable and aren't going to believe. Strong rationalism naively assumes a neutral starting point for human reason. And I say it's naive because we know that human thinking and human reason is affected by our context and our worldview. We've already discussed some of that. Additionally, a rationalistic view undermines faith and trust. Jesus himself, right, said, "Blessed are those who believe and have not seen." Lastly, rationalism fails to consider the effects of sin on the mind. Right? We don't all think alike because sin alters the way that we think. Right? Sin alters our views and our logic and our reason. So we can't imagine that we would all have one coherent thought in mind. So it's problematic. What do we do between the fideist on one side and the rationalist on the other? Using reason and argument, here's what I would say is faith seeking understanding. So using reason and argument to analyze, defend, and assess faith while acknowledging the limitations of human reason. Right? There's a guy named Anselm, and Anselm actually gives us this quotation. He says, "I do not seek to understand in order to believe. I believe in order to understand." Right? So as we think through this idea of faith seeking understanding, this is the middle ground. This is the tension that I mentioned earlier that we have to kind of hold between two ends. So here's what I want to do is I'm going to end this video with this idea of faith-seeking understanding. I'm going to post another video here in just a second that I want you to go and look at. And it's a video put out by a guy named William Lane Craig, who is a Christian apologist, a defender of the faith. And he unpacks this argument from Anselm called Anselm's ontological argument. So I want you to look at this Anselm's ontological argument next. And so this idea of Anselm's ontological argument, I want you to go and I want you to watch it. Then I want you to pick back up at part number 2 here of A Mind Prepared for Theology. And then we're going to kind of all tie it all together, all right? So enjoy the Anselm's ontological argument video, and we'll see you here in just a second as we kind of try to wrap the balance and hold the tension here of a mind prepared for theology.